Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about another archetype. But I have a feeling this is not going to be like my other videos. This particular archetype, I don't know what it is about it. I just don't jive exactly with it. I'm going to do my best to talk positively about what it offers, and honestly, it's a good archetype. I just feel that there's a lot of problems with it that might not be apparent when you first look at it. But before we get into that, if you enjoy this video, you can leave a like. If you want to see more like it, subscribe. And as well, if you want to talk table talk, we talk all things table talk on our official Discord, link down in the description, including war games like Warhammer 40k, and I always recruit there first for any of the games I run on the channel. So if you want the chance to play with me and my friends, that's the place to be. Not only that, but we also have a Twitter that you can follow at if you want something a little less committal and you just want to see whenever I have any big announcements, that's the place to look. But with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about the Cathartic Mage. So the Cathartic Mage is an interesting archetype because honestly, it's pretty easy to get into. All you need is a charisma of 14 or the ability to cast spells from spell slots, which makes this pretty open for most characters who do want to add some spell casting to their spell list. Now, essentially, the theme behind the Cathartic Mage is that you harness your raw emotional energy to fuel spells. And picking up this dedication, if you're not already a spellcaster, you become a spontaneous spellcaster, giving you training in spell attack rolls and spell DCs. And you choose a cantrip from any tradition of your choice, picking that tradition as you move forward going on with the class. So you actually get to pick what tradition of magic you pick from, which is a pretty good option, honestly, and it makes the Cathartic Mage very versatile. Now, if you're already a spellcaster, then if you're a repertoire caster, then you gain one additional cantrip that's added to your repertoire, and if you're a prepared caster, you can prepare this one extra cantrip as in addition to the other cantrips you prepare for the day. Now, what really sets a Cathartic Mage apart and makes it more than just a diverse spellcasting based archetype dedication is the fact that you gain what's called a catharsis. Now, catharsis is attached to an emotion, and they may have something known as an emotional focus, which becomes the focus of that particular emotion. And there's problems with that. I'm going to get into that here in just a moment, but let's look at what actually is brought up here. So you gain a catharsis reaction. This reaction is what you use to essentially go into your emotional fervor, and it also gives you access to catharsis activation, which happens when you use your cathartic reaction. Not only that, but when you're in your emotional fervor, you do get access to a spell that you can cast only while in this state, but it does consume spell slots as normal, which does give prepared casters something of a repertoire feature, flexible spell casting, where you can use that spell as many times, you just need to use spell slots. It's interesting, but limiting because each catharsis only comes with one spell. So, you get that one spell as much as you like, I suppose. Not only that, but when your emotional fervor, I should mention, lasts for 3 rounds. And then after those 3 rounds are over, you suffer from what's called a emotional fallout, where you get some negative benefits or some negative penalties, and then you cannot use your cathartic reaction again until you settle your emotions, which is your standard 10-minute rest action. It also removes your emotional fallout more often than not. And yeah, each of these also do come as well with a focus spell. So we're actually going to look over some of these. I'm not going to go into extreme details on all the things they offer, like spells or anything like that, because this video will be way, way longer than it's already going to be, and it's going to be a really long video in general. Let's start off with anger. Anger is triggered whenever an enemy deals damage to you, and you can't take this reaction while you're fatigued. Okay, makes sense. Same as rage, more or less. When you activate your catharsis, if you're grabbed, immobilized, or restrained, you can attempt to escape. And if you succeed, The creature or hazard imposing this condition, so if like it's a trap, for instance, holding you down, then takes force damage equal to your level. Now, during your emotional fervor, when you cast a spell from a spell slot, so this does not include cantrips, if the spell deals damage and doesn't have a duration, you gain a status bonus to the spell's damage equal to the spell's level. Pretty good. You can also cast the spell Draw Ire, which is really good if you're not an innate caster, but instead like a fighter or something who decided to pick up some spell casting through Cathartic Mage, allowing you to essentially tank a little better, even though your spell casting is not going to be as good as a spellcaster, and you might not get the effect off as you desire. Draw Ire is still a pretty decent spell overall. Now, the emotional fallout for anger is you become fatigued until you settle your emotions, giving you a penalty on your AC and your saving throws, which makes your character vulnerable, and that's not a big issue. 3 rounds is a lot. Most combats last between 3 to 5 rounds. So that by the time you actually probably even get to use this, the combat will be over and you'll be more or less safe. This also has access to a focus spell that you can pick up with one of the later feats. Anger gets Athletic Rush. Awe is another interesting one. If you or an ally within 30 feet critically succeeds an attack roll against an enemy's AC or a skill check against one of their DCs, then you can use your reaction to get your catharsis. And the activation is if you're fascinated or stupefied, you can attempt an additional save to end the effect if a save will be allowed. So it can't be any self-imposed effects, but effects that were given to you by a spell or ability that you had to make a save against. Can be good. Very situational, but can be good. Your emotional fervor, whenever you cast a spell, choose one creature that was hit by the spell roll, or failed its saving throw, if any. The creature becomes fascinated with you until the end of its next turn. It's then temporarily immune to this fervor effect for an hour. You also gain access to the spell Glitter Dust. The fallout is you become flat-footed until you settle your emotions. Arguably worse than being fatigued, because at least with fatigue it's only a -1 to your AC. This is a -2. Granted, your saves are relatively untouched. And the focus spell you can pick up from this one is Dazzling Flash, and you don't need a religious symbol as a material component for it. Dedication is a much more awkward one because you have a commitment to protect your elemental focus. So unless it's an NPC, it's probably going to be one of your party members. This can be awkward and can be very uncomfortable in some situations. Something I will get to once we're done talking with all of these, but dedication is one of the problematic ones. The trigger is if your emotional focus takes damage from an enemy while within 30 feet of you. When you activate your catharsis, your emotional focus gains a number of temporary hit points equal to half your level rounded up. These temporary hit points last for a minute. Potentially really good for a support kind of benefit. During your emotional fervor, your spells that target your emotional focus gain the benefit of the reach spell, extending their range, which is pretty cool. When you cast a healing spell that affects your emotional focus also gains temporary hit points equal to the spell's level in addition to the spell's effects. These temporary HP last for a minute. You also get access to Spirit Link. That's not as good because when your catharsis activates, they get temporary hit points. Unless those temporary hit points get burned through right away, which is possible, you might end up running into it. And not only that, but honestly, most of these are not going to offer all too much. I mean, like the most you can expect is 10, which isn't a whole lot. It does help though. The emotional fallout is you can't cast spells until you're adjacent to your emotional focus. That's a pretty devastating effect, honestly. Being unable to cast spells is really bad. Now, if you're picking up Cathartic Mage, as a non-caster, that's not as big a deal. But if you're a caster, that's pretty devastating, honestly. The focus spell you can pick up is Protect Your Sacrifice. Fear is an interesting one. You're triggered by by becoming frightened by an enemy effect. You cannot intentionally trigger yourself or have an ally trigger you, which again, we'll address this. And with a fear spell or demoralize or anything like that, it has to be an enemy, which can be difficult because fear effects are not common until much later in the game. So that's something to consider. Now, your activation increases your fear frightened value by 1 to a maximum of 4, which sounds terrible, but your emotional fervor effect, you don't take the status penalty from the frightened condition to your spell DCs or your spell attack bonus, and instead actually gain that status bonus to your spell attack rolls, and your enemy or your targets of your spells get that penalty to their saving throws against your spells. I don't know why they don't just increase your saving or your DCs for the duration, interestingly. But yeah, so when you attack an enemy with a spell, they get a penalty to their save equal to what your frightened value currently is. That's how it's written anyway. You also get access to the Fear spell, which is a really good spell overall. Now, your emotional fallout is actually really devastating, though. You become fleeing for 2 rounds, which means you spend all your actions running away from either the source that frightened you in the first place or your current location. That's really bad, and that means for 2 turns, you are completely useless. Now, again, most emotional fervors last pretty much for the combat, and then after the combat is over, you run away. And this is something that you just have to time fear very appropriately for. The focus spell you get access to is Walking Nightmare. Hatred is another complicated one in a variety of ways, but not as bad as Dedication. Essentially, you designate like the big bad as your focus or some NPC. And essentially what happens is your trigger is based on if you start your first turn in an encounter against your emotional focus or one of their followers. So this can be pretty broadly used. It just means that your character actually really hates someone you're dealing with. But this can also make it for like random encounters and everything completely unusable most of the time. If the encounter includes multiple eligible followers and doesn't include your actual emotional focus, choose one of them to act as your emotional focus for this encounter. Which means you actually only can pick one of the enemies to act as your focus. That means once they're gone, you can't... Well, I mean, I guess that's not really a big issue, honestly. But anyway, the activation, you can step or stride, but you must end this movement closer to your emotional focus, which is why you designate a target in the first place. Good for a non-caster, bad for a primary caster. Not too terrible. During your emotional fervor, your emotional focus is flat-footed to you and takes a -2 status penalty to saves against your spells. You also are flat-footed to your emotional focus and also take a status penalty to your saves against theirs. You get access to the spell Blood Vendetta, which is really good and works very well because the enemy, your focus will probably be attacking you because you're the most vulnerable, so you can get some payback back. But when your emotional fervor ends, you become stunned too, which is also really devastating. Not as bad as Fear, but you almost lose an entire round to it. You also get access to the focus spell Cry of Destruction. Joy is a pretty harmless one. Honestly, I don't see any issues with this one. Your trigger is you critically succeed on an attack roll or save, or an enemy critically fails a save against you. You're essentially... laugh at them. I don't know. It's really weird, especially because they have Pride a little bit later, which I feel matches this more, but whatever. Anyway, your activation reduces the value of any frightened or stupefied conditions on you by 1, and you end any persistent mental damage you have. Persistent mental damage is not very, very common, and you'll probably almost never use that one. Frightened or stupefied are a little bit more common, but not super common, so I don't know. It's okay. Emotional fervor, you get a bonus of +1 to performance checks and to the spell attack rolls of emotion spells. Enemies take a -1 status penalty to saves against your emotion spells. You also get access to Hideous Laughter. After your emotional fallout, or after your emotional fervor, your fallout is you become fatigued, and you gain access to the Unimpeded Stride focus spell if you take the appropriate feat. Love is worse than Dedication. And I think everyone can guess why at this point. But again, I'll talk about this a little bit later. Your trigger is your emotional focus takes damage from an enemy while within 30 feet of you. Same as Dedication. Your activation is if either you or your emotional focus is confused or controlled, one of you can attempt a new saving throw against one confusing or controlling effect, ending the condition if the new save is successful. If you're both eligible, your emotional focus gets the new save rather than yourself. So essentially you always prioritize them whenever this activates. Your Emotional Fervor gives you a +1 stats bonus to will saves, and if you cast a spell to benefit your emotional focus, the bonus increases to +3 until the start of your next turn. So it can make you very determined to help them out. You gain access to the Soothe spell, which is a really good healing and support spell. I actually really love Soothe. Emotional Fallout, you're fascinated with your emotional focus for 1 minute, which is awkward. And you get Soothing Words as your focus spell if you take the appropriate feat. Misery, if you gain persistent damage from a foe, which this is actually really common, so I can honestly say this is probably one of the better catharsises out there. You gain a number of temporary hit points equal to your level. That's also a really good effect. Emotional Fervor, you choose not to attempt a flat check to end a persistent damage you're taking. When you cast a damaging spell, you can choose one creature that failed its save or that you hit with your spell attack roll. That target takes persistent damage of the same type the spell dealt, of an amount equal to the highest amount of persistent damage you are currently taking. You can't choose a creature that's already taking persistent damage, though. You also get access to the spell Phantom Pain. I actually really like this one. It gives you a little bit of tankiness, or at least some to negate some of the effects of persistent damage you're taking. And you take that damage and you throw it back at someone, doing, a lot of different possible persistent damages. Really good against enemies that have weaknesses as well. I really, really like Misery specifically. Your Emotional Fallout, you take an untyped penalty to any damage you would deal with any spell you cast until you settle your emotions. Untyped is really weird. They've never used it in any of the books before. This just doesn't have a particular type. So it's not like a status, circumstance, or item. This is just a blank. They should just say you just take a penalty to any damage you would deal. It would mean the same thing. The penalty is equal to 1 per spell level, which is pretty devastating. Well, I guess it can be devastating. For higher level spells, it can feel kind of bad. It's not really all that bad for an Emotional Fallout, though. And this is really good for a spellcaster in particularly, even if, that penalty kind of does suck. It's honestly not that bad. You get access to the Focus spell, Savor the Sting. 2 more. Oh my goodness, there's so many. Pride. With Pride, your trigger is if you critically fail an attack roll or saving throw, which makes no sense. If you critically fail an attack roll or saving throw, you get the catharsis of your pride. But I don't know. It's a really weird one. I think, what one was it before? Joy should be swapped with it, or at least done differently. I don't know. The catharsis activation, though, is the critical failure becomes just a failure, which can be pretty good, honestly, especially if it's a saving throw, which makes Pride actually really, really good. It doesn't make sense, but it at least is really, really good because it can prevent you from taking some serious negative side effects from whatever you're rolling against. For your Emotional Fervor, each time you cast an illusion spell until the start of your next turn, any critical failure you roll on an attack roll or saving throw is a failure instead. Okay, that's really weird. I don't know. An illusion spell specifically? Why illusion? Why? This makes no sense for veil or for Pride. I mean, I guess I don't know. This is a really weird one, honestly. Any critical failure roll you roll on an attack roll or saving throw is a failure instead. Okay, I mean, this offers you protection against failures, which is cool, I guess. Just really weird. You get the access to the spell Color Spray while you're in this fervor state. Your fallout is you momentarily lose track of what's real. You become confused for 1 round, which can be really bad in combat. Again, probably not likely to happen in combat, but still. I do think that there is an error here because there's another spell called Mirror Image, but they have a spell here called Color Spray. And you can't access these spells unless you're in your immersion. I think this is a error because this makes no sense. I think Mirror Image is better than Color Spray, honestly, and can work with more types of characters. But I don't know. I don't know why this is here. It doesn't make sense for the Fallout area. I think this is just an error in the book. Focus spell, you get access to Veil of Confidence. For Remorse, our final one, thank the gods. Your trigger is an ally within 30 feet drops to 0 hit points. Really bad and honestly not something you want to hedge your bets on. Things are going bad already when that happens, so Remorse is not good for just that alone. Your activation is you step or stride. You must end this movement closer to the triggering ally. Potentially really good if you're a healer, though. Honestly, that's a very solid effect if you're a healer. For your emotional fervor, any spells that you cast that restores hit points to the triggering ally gets a status bonus to the hit points healed equal to the spell's level, or double the spell's level if the ally is at 0 hit points, which probably will happen. So that's pretty good. Get twice the spell's level in HP when you use healing on someone. Really good. This gives you access to the spell Warrior's Regret. And the emotional fallout is that your emotions crush you, become stupefied too until you settle your emotions, which is really, really bad as a spellcaster. And it's until you settle your emotions, so you can't even reduce it unless, you're pretty much done with the combat. Really bad in the middle of combat, but hopefully an ally is not dropping early enough in a combat where this comes up. Then the focus spell, you get access to Healer's Blessing. So that's a lot, and we've already talked for 20 minutes. And I haven't even done much more than the dedication feat itself and the emotional states. But yeah, okay. You know what? Let's just talk about the feats, and then I'll kind of give my grapes after we're done. They're not that bad. A lot of the feats are really good. And again, this as a spellcasting archetype is pretty good, especially because even if you're a non-spellcaster, you can pick this up as long as you have 14 charisma, and you get access to the cast a spell activity, which is pretty good. So the first feat actually that they have is basic cathartic spellcasting. You get basic spellcasting benefits, assuming that you're picking from the tradition that you initially picked up with Cathartic Mage, or the one that you use to gain access to Cathartic Mage. Either way, gives you access to, a first, second, and third level spell. Pretty solid. Cathartic Focus Spell is where you pick up those focus spells I mentioned before in each of the different catharsises. Work Yourself Up is by far the worst feat I've ever seen in the game. It is bad. It's really, really terrible. I can see some situations where it could be helpful, but let me read it out to you first. So it's 2 actions, and it has the requirement that you have a reaction available and aren't currently being prevented from using your catharsis, like Rage is if you are fatigued. So that would be the only really example, honestly. You concentrate on your mental state and you try to rile yourself up. You can then take your catharsis reaction. So this costs technically 2 actions and a reaction. Now you could argue that they're just saying that you take the benefits of the reaction, but then I don't know why the requirements would be that you have a reaction available. So that tells me that the intent of the writing is that this takes 2 actions, then a reaction, which is pretty rough, honestly. This causes your catharsis activation and you enter your emotional fervor as normal. Okay, that's not bad. The fervor will last until the end of your turn. And at the end of your emotional fervor, as per normal, you experience your emotional fallout. And then, obviously, until you settle your emotions, you can't go back into your cathartic state. So you spend 2 actions and a reaction to gain access to your to your catharsis activation, which could be helpful in the moment, but for most of them, it's like, let's take into consideration, I don't know, let's take hatred. You step or stride and must end closer to your emotional focus. So you spend 2 actions to step or stride. Okay, that doesn't sound super great. Now, for something like anger, it's good because it allows you to attempt to immediately escape, and if you do so, you can deal damage to the enemy, but that means you're spending 2 actions to attempt to escape. And that's just to deal force damage equal to your level if you do manage to succeed. It doesn't seem like it's really worth it. Not only that, but your fervor lasts until the end of your turn, which it currently is. At the end of your turn, then you go into your fervor state, meaning you take your penalties immediately, and you can't even cast a spell, which most emotional fervor abilities focus on. This is complete garbage. This is absolutely useless. Like I said, there's some catharsis activations you could possibly justify, but more often than not, they're a waste of action load with not major benefit, and then you go into your emotional state, making another cost for taking this action. I legitimately would not have minded if this was a free action at the beginning of your turn and you have a reaction available. You use your reaction and a free action to go into your state. You get a turn of your emotional fervor without needing to have it be triggered. That would be fine for me. It would be a little bit of a heavy cost, don't get me wrong, but that would make it better. Or I would even take it where your emotional fervor lasts for its normal amount of time, which is 3 rounds. For 3 rounds, I mean, essentially your first round gets wasted, but you still have 2 more rounds of your emotional fervor, and you might have a catharsis trigger that wouldn't normally activate in the combat. So it would be a good way of triggering it and still getting 2 rounds of benefit out of it. But that's not what it reads. It reads it lasts until the end of your turn. It's just really bad. It's I don't know. It's something that I think they need to really rework or reword. I think Cathartic Mage actually has a few flaws, and I don't know. Anyway, let's continue. Expert spellcasting. You get expert spellcasting benefits. Sorry, expert cathartic spellcasting. Really good. You get more spells. Pretty solid. Infectious emotions. Infectious emotions allows you that when you use your catharsis, or when you're triggered, essentially, one ally within 30 feet gains the catharsis activation benefit in addition to you. If these benefits require an emotional focus, they use your emotional focus as they're experiencing an empathic imprint of your emotions. I think that's really cool for narrative. I think that's a really interesting thing, and that's something you see in movies like all the time. It's actually very interesting. Depending on the activation benefit, it might be impossible to grant it to an ally. For instance, Pride could only have an effect for an ally if both you and the ally critically failed the same saving throw against the same effect, which means that honestly for some of the catharsises it doesn't work, but it does work for the majority. Overall, infectious emotions I think is pretty good, and it has some really good narrative quality to it. And last but not least, master cathartic spellcasting. So where does that leave us, right? I don't like cathartic Mage because when you give players essentially a reason to focus on the emotions of your character, they oftentimes drop the logic behind it. And not only that, but with something like dedication, love, this can create bad character like interactions in the party. It can create some good ones too. Everything negative I have to say is only for the thought of making this general for everyone to pick up will cause issues that are uncomfortable and potentially even making the game not safe for some players on an emotional state or social way. That can and hopefully will be countered by people who use this to great effect and can make characters who are very diverse and dynamic. Just because your character is being emotionally triggered does not mean that they become illogical or unthinking. And having a character who works through their anger and can utilize their anger in an intelligent way is something that's very fascinating. But there's also, with equal amount or even more, players who take the anger, their character becomes the Hulk and they become destructive and probably unruly, maybe even attacking their friends because they're angry. You know what I mean? So, yeah, not only that, but I feel like Cathartic Mage has some errors in it, like Pride having 2 spells, even though they should only have 1. That 1 feat that's just completely useless and unreasonable to expect a player to take it. It just, like, it doesn't even really offer really anything all too much. Cathartic Mage is really good because it's one of the better, I feel like, spellcasting archetype dedications that make it available to most characters. Just having a 14 charisma is pretty good. And this is a really good pickup for some characters who want to add some spellcasting to their kit. The problem is it's all emotionally focused, and again, a lot of these emotions can cause players to act in very dumb ways or in ways that pull you from the narrative because it seems unreasonable, because their character might take a sudden twist or turn in how they rational things. And that's where Cathartic Mage sits for me. I think that there's a lot of good potential. I think players can have a really strong ability to utilize Cathartic Mage to its best. But it's a archetype that, when put in the wrong hands, can do more damage than good. And honestly, this can cause players to even possibly leave the game. And it makes the DM have to be on guard whenever a player takes this archetype specifically. I don't know. I don't like Cathartic Mage personally. You may love it and it may has worked great for your games. That's completely okay. And I agree it possibly can be very, very good for games. I wouldn't even necessarily ban this from my games, but I'm saying from a very general perspective, this kind of archetype can be problematic. So it's important that if you want to take this, talk to your GM about it, or if one of your players want to talk this and you're a GM, talk to your players about it, the repercussions, and make sure that this becomes a fun, enjoyable experience for everyone, and you don't just focus on living out your emotional state because that's what your character is based on. Your character is more dynamic than that, and emotions can play a much more diverse role in your character's personality rather than becoming their personality trait. So that's it for me. I hope you all enjoy this. Thank you all so much for watching. Sorry if I had to read this because I was just not going to remember everything word for word. A lot of these also are a little weird, a little jank, and this may have just been a lot more of a distracted one. I promise this won't happen with most other archetypes. Cathartic Mage is just one of the ones I really just don't like in general, but I still think it's good. I think it's really good, especially because everyone can use it. Anyway, beyond that, thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.